kako priča, stvarno je velika faca, a naš glavni predmet, tvrdi predmet o kojem ćemo pričati danas je ovo. Dragi moji ljudi, ovo je Biblija. Ovo je Biblija za sve vas kreativce, wannabe kreativce, kreativce u nastajanju, sve vas koji se bavite bilo kojom formom biznisa ili općenito promišljanja svijeta, unutra ćete saznati razne pikanterije, super neke primjere kako su ljudi totalno odbacili zdrav razum, a zapravo postali jako uspješni. Dakle, ovo je knjiga koju je napisao Roryja Sutherland, jedan od glavnih mislioca u području biznisa evo u zadnje vrijeme na svijetu. Puno ljudi mi je pričalo o njemu da su ga u Kanu slušali, da su se oduševili i zato smo ga i pozvali da podijeli svoje znanje sa vama. Evo, ja sam odmah Imagovce pitala, dobro, vi ste marketinška agencija, zašto ste vi odlučili sad izdavati knjige? Otkud je sad to krenulo? A Imago su mi rekli, gledaj, nelogična su vremena, ništa nema smisla, pa ajmo se mi baviti nečim najbesmislenijim, a to je objaviti jednu besmislenu knjigu, puno besmislica, kako uz pomoć izbacivanja logike postati uspješan. I moram priznati da evo za sad se čini da su pogodili zlatnu koku, jako puno narudžbi je došlo. Ljudi, ovo je jedna jako fina, pitka i zabavna knjiga, jako brzo se čita, iako će vas možda prestrašiti ova debljina, od tih 300 stranica sam ja evo u 3 dana uspjela pročitati, ide ovako, tako da naručite. Prvih 100 koji naruči dobit će besplatnu poštarinu, a inače je idealan poklon i za vašeg klijenta, za vašu agenciju, za vašeg supruga, ljubavnika, punicu, svi će se naći u ovoj knjizi, za svakog ima ponešto, tako da molim vas nemojte propustiti tu priliku. Evo, ja sam dosta pričala, da ne uzimam vrijeme našoj glavnoj zvijezdi. Ja bih vas sad pozvala da ga pozdravite jednim toplim aplauzom. Ja vas ne vidim, ali sigurna sam da plješćete sad u ovom trenutku. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Roryja Sutherlanda. Hello, Rory.
Hello. What a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, we are so sorry that we are not able to let you talk in Rovinj this year, but we'll make up for it the next year for sure.
I shall be in Rovinj next year, I think. I mean, assuming the aircraft are flying again, I think I'll do everything I can to... Maybe I'll go by train. I don't know.
Okay, we really hope so. So the first question is, what do you think about our book design? It's really solid, I would say. The solid black with golden letters. It seems to me like a Star Wars Bible to me, this creation issue. What do you think about it?
It's a fabulous issue, yeah. I mean, the British edition is pure gold, which is a bit over the top because I've had complaints from people who say it's impossible to read on the beach because you blind people who are nearby. But this one, the combination of black and gold is inspired. It's genius. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's sinister. Thank you so much.
And of course, Alchemy was all about turning black lead into gold. So the two colors couldn't be better.
Yeah, it has sense. It has sense. So what's the situation in the UK now? Are you still on lockdown? Where are you now? Are you doing business from home? What's the situation?
And actually, I mean, very interestingly, we have, you know, the death rate is now slowing and the infection rate is almost certainly slowing. We're doing more tests, so it's very difficult to tell because obviously the more people you test, the more infections you'll uncover. And there seems to be an announcement on Sunday to say that the lockdown is going to be reduced a little bit. So the suspicion is they'll allow people, for example, to spend more time outdoors. And I think that's based on the evidence. And if you think about it, warmer countries, for the most part, have been less affected by colder ones. And one of the possibilities is that it seems that the transmission of the disease, the virus, outside seems to be much rarer than it is indoors.
And how do you feel about that all? Are you depressed?
There's a terrible thing. There's a terrible thing, which I don't like to say, but there's a phrase in English, it's an ill wind that blows no man good. And I think some positives will emerge from this, not least, actually, the amount of remote working we can do. So I've always believed that there's an irrational aversion to working through video conference and working remotely, and that business people have a completely irrational preference for, always going to a physical meeting, traveling to a meeting, flying to a meeting, when in many cases our time could be much better spent doing what we're doing now. In fact, I mean, if you think about it, I've already had meetings today with Australia and meetings with the United States, and obviously a few meetings in various parts of the UK. In the course of having a video meeting with someone in Gloucester, which is a small rural part of the UK, I discovered a very interesting tech business, which before lockdown, I never, if I'd said to the office, I'm going to travel to this rural area to look for tech companies, people would have said I was mad. So in some respects, environmentally and in terms of what you might call white collar productivity, I think we might see something actually very important emerge from this, because it always interested me, and I'll be very cynical. If you think about it, if the travel and entertainment costs in businesses had been mostly incurred by junior staff, not by the senior management, there would have been pressure on everybody to video conference 10 years ago.
Yeah, but it hasn't been.
so there was a degree of self-interest in our preference for air travel over everything else. And I think what's happened now is we've discovered through what is effectively the simultaneous imposition of new technology, we've discovered, first of all, that it's much better than it was 6 years ago. I think a lot of people were polluted by memories of disastrous Skype calls in 2006, where everything went wrong and I would suddenly freeze like this, and my sound would disappear. And they've discovered, first of all, that huge technological progress has been made since then. And that if you think about it, what could be more efficient? I'm sitting at home, I'm talking to 200 people in Croatia and Serbia.
Yeah, you're right.
Now, I'm able to talk. I've talked to our office in Tbilisi in Georgia. I've talked to our office in California, offices which I wouldn't visit from one decade to the next normally. And you discover, of course, fantastically talented people. We can all work together, okay?
Yeah.
We can create virtual work teams with a sense of unity and a sense of cohesion that would have been impossible before because of the travel costs and the time costs involved. And I always say, look, in travel within a city, there's an annoying gap between taking a tube and taking a taxi. In other words, you can either get on a very crowded train and pay £1 and get to where you need to go to, or you can do it in privacy where you can make phone calls, but it costs £20. And I always said there's a huge gap between the two. And in the same way, there's a really annoying gap between email and air travel. We need something in between those two extremes. I've always thought in transport, if you could just have a little electric pod which drove you around at 10 miles an hour and you paid £3, we'd be really happy. But instead, you have these two extremes. And I think you'll put it this way, you never win business over email. You never win business over the telephone. But you can win business in America or the rest of Europe over Zoom quite easily. I was saying the same thing to people in South Africa yesterday. You're in the right time zone. I said, don't confine your business activities to South Africa. Start doing business with California or with Singapore.
Yeah, that's definitely an advantage. But still, we need live conferences. We need the Rovin. So please don't advocate.
No. I will be back next year.
Please come. No Zoom next year, please. No. We want to hug you and see you in person. Okay, I'd like to discuss this unique moment in history shaped by this corona pandemic. So it's a challenging time for both business and the society. What has really changed? And do you see, is it all gloomy or do you see kind of light at the end of the tunnel? What do you think?
We don't, to be honest, we don't yet know quite enough. And it's very difficult. It's worth remembering that we knew so little at the very beginning that the only measures you could take were extreme measures. Sweden was probably the one exception to that. But knowing so little about what the fatality rate might be, what the transmission rate might be, there is some optimistic news starting to emerge from a team at the University of Liverpool, which suggest now. This bears on what my book says. So one of the lessons in my book at the beginning, one of the 11 rules of alchemy is don't try and solve for average. And the problem with solving for average is if you basically say, what is the transmission rate, what we call R of the virus, the only way you can reduce R, if you don't know anything else, is by basically stopping everybody moving and sending everybody home. Now, if we start to find out how R varies. So, for example, some people may transmit very little. Some people may be not very susceptible to catching the disease. There may be a large percentage of people who will never catch. Children, for the most part, don't seem to spread it at all. So there's no case of anybody catching this virus from a child. No documented case of a child spreading it.
Yeah, you see, and the kindergartens were all closed. The schools were all closed. So
all closed.
Day by day, we are learning some new things.
And so we learn new things. And bear in mind, my background was in direct marketing. My first, 10 years of work were in direct marketing. And I always say, find out what's different, and the problem becomes much easier to solve. Because if you have a general problem, the only way you can solve it is with general across-the-board solutions, because you're trying to solve for the average. And so you go, okay, everybody must do the same thing. Now I think what we'll learn is that quite a lot of it is spread in hospitals, okay, which is something that didn't seem to occur to people. Very little seems to be spread by children. Very little seems to be spread outdoors. As we know more about that, we can intervene in little targeted ways where you say, okay, there won't be any conferences for 3 or 4 months. Sorry, Revenge, I think, will be safe next year, but I don't see any conferences happening. Large crowd events are going to be banned. Because the risk of a super spreading event is too high. But equally, outdoor restaurants will probably be fine. I wouldn't confidently recommend that yet. But as we discover less about the average and more about what makes people different. And this actually is a marketing question, because in academic science, people are looking for generalizable rules that are true of everybody. And in marketing, to have a successful business, your insight doesn't need to be true of everybody. Okay, if you take the Dyson vacuum cleaner, it would be ridiculous to say that everybody on the planet would spend 600 euros on a vacuum cleaner.
That's one of examples of your book.
It's one of my examples. But if 10% of people will, you've got an incredibly profitable business. And so I think the influence of economics is for us to treat markets as if they're kind of homogeneous. And the most boring thing economists always say is people want lower prices. Yeah, I mean, people will pay less if you give them the opportunity to pay less. They're not insane. But for a very large part of people, people want to pay slightly more for less of better things. Yeah. And there's a wonderful piece of information on Google, where a presentation I had from Google, they look at searches for cheap air travel, cheap, whatever. And they look at the number of searches for best. And for the last about 20 years or so, best has been growing and cheap has been falling. And in fact, the 2008 financial crisis didn't affect that at all. That was about the point when good overtook cheap. Cheap's continuing to go down, goods continuing to go up.
That's an amazing lesson to all the people who
It's a fantastic lesson.
It's also in the book.
Don't listen to your finance director who says what we've got to do is we've got to drop our prices. Maybe you do, but that's the last thing you should do, not the first thing you should do.
Yeah. That's a fact.
And one of the things in the book, which is an example of alchemy, is sometimes you'll sell more if you put your prices up.
For luxury goods, yeah.
Particularly true of luxury goods. This was a case in KFC. And KFC is sort of interesting because you have KFC, obviously, in
everywhere.
You go to KFC in a weird way for two reasons. You go for a bargain, but you also go for a treat. And if you price a treat meal too low, people think, well, that's not a bargain and it's not a treat, so I don't want it.
Yeah, that's suspicious.
This is exactly what happened.
Yeah, I would like to know something specifically about our markets. What's the situation in the UK? You know what happened in Balkans when the crisis started? The markets shrinked and everything was, nobody knew what was going on. The budgets were cut. All the activities stopped. What will happen now? Is it the same thing in the UK? Because it's terrible now in Balkans. We don't know, on which budgets we can count because everything stopped. Everything is in the air and nobody knows what's going on.
You still have your own currency, which is a big help.
Thank you.
So that's one thing we have in common. Okay. Now, I would say that the euro is a classic example of an attempt to solve for average. In fact, it kind of solves for Germany, to be absolutely honest. Okay. So if you take the case of Italy, by the way, I don't think this was deliberate. I don't think this was a deliberate German policy. It's just their obsession with, fiscal responsibility drives the currency to reside at a price where it prevents the imaginary Deutschmark can't go up and the imaginary lira can't go down. And the problem of solving for average is that actually the average often doesn't exist. As I said in KFC, some people are going in for a bargain, some people are going in for a treat. The person who goes in for a bargain at lunchtime may want a treat in the evening. And the euro is a classic case of people at a very high level trying to solve for everybody and actually failing everybody because the average person doesn't really exist. You're either one of those Northern European countries like Finland or the Netherlands, whose currency should probably go up, or you're Italy / Greece, where you need your currencies to fall. So there's opportunity for you there for simply for that reason. So you won't get trapped in a kind of deflationary spiral, I would hope. I'd say, by the way, the opportunities for your tourism are immense. Because what I call short haul but less discovered tourism.
Yeah, also this year, or from the next year, because this year will be gloomy for everybody.
This year will be gloomy, I agree. Although there will be.
Count of this year. We can't count on it.
It could change if we learn more. I mean, the problem actually is not the destination; it's air travel, because this is another question, which is airports have all been designed around maximum efficiency. And maximum efficiency effectively means maximum crowding.
Oh, shit, yeah.
Now, interestingly, one advantage you might have is some smaller airports. So one very fascinating thing, which, if I were the owner of, for example, there is an airport, is it Pula, which is not that far from Revenge?
Yeah, Pula.
Now, I imagine Pula gets 4 flights a day. Is that right? Or maybe 6.
Yeah. About that.
Okay. Now, actually, the opportunity to open flights from Pula to, for example, London Southend, which is an underused airport, to find airports in the UK which are actually very low use and actually have flights from a small airport to a small airport. That might be quite interesting, because I was talking to some people in Africa, in Kenya. And I said, the strange thing is, you're trying to sell safari holidays. I said, last year, people were frightened of the lions. I said, this year, nobody's frightened of the lions. They're frightened of JFK Airport. So I said, you're in a completely peculiar position.
Yeah, that's also one of the ideas that we should follow. Think outside of the box and see the opportunities in this hell that's going on.
So local to local flights could be a very, very clever thing to market. So, if you take those smaller airports where effectively you have a plane load of people arriving and then they all fly off and then another lot of people arrive, then you could actually use the airport very cleverly in that way.
Yeah. And maybe we should, make a story about Croatia, corona-free, small country, it's small airports, right. Not so crowded places, and then we'll save our tourist season. We'll see.
There is a lesson here, a wider lesson about scale, which is when you make something bigger in scale, the benefits of scale are always very immediately apparent and quantifiable, and the costs appear later. So, if there's a generalizable thing, there are exceptions to this. There are rural pockets of the virus in the UK, but the big cities, and in Europe, that's Madrid, Paris, London, and New York, of course, disproportionately suffer from this for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And of course, the big cities are dependent on public transport, which is significantly below ground public transport, which is the worst of the lot, because the air quality on underground railways is terrible at the best of times, to be honest. And so, the benefit of small is the benefit of small and intimate and slightly remote can't be underplayed.
Okay, it's optimistic to our little country of 4 million people. Thank you so much for this prognosis. The one thing I have to repeat is the essence of this book. The essence of this book is not to rely on these rational solutions and basic logic, but to think out of the box. But the thing is this applicable now in these very peculiar times, when everything's in the air and nobody knows what's going on? Are maybe the firms and the markets even more conservative or even more cautious than ever? How do they get ideas from this book? How are they applicable now? What would you say?
Yes. One of the things is that the reason the book's called Alchemy, and the reason I think this is important, is that companies, also true of scientists, by the way, less so of doctors. I always see doctors as being it's part science, part art, part practice. But scientists, particularly sort of virologists and business people, are obsessed with everything appearing rational. And the first rule of being rational is that you make the rule that magic can't exist.
Okay.
There's no room for magic. So as a result, you don't look for magic. And also, if people present you with magic, you don't believe in it. And if you don't believe in it, you can't make it work. And my argument is that marketing and marketing imagination, because it exists in the level of psychology, not in the level of physics, still leaves enormous room for magic. I mean, literally, the 600 euro vacuum cleaner is a kind of magic.
Magic, that's right.
But an example I always give, I don't know if you have Uber at all in Zagreb or in Belgrade.
Yeah, we have.
I always love your countries because they're wonderfully easygoing with capitalism, aren't you? You don't tend to regulate anything obsessively,
That's right.
There's a business, yep, let's do it. And the interesting thing about that is there's a kind of magic there. My contention is that's a company valued at billions of dollars. A large part of its success is magic, and the reason is when you order an Uber cab, you can watch the car on the map. Now, it doesn't reduce the duration of your wait for a taxi, but psychologically, it massively reduces the frustration. Because you just look at it and go, oh, look, he's stuck at that junction. I'll have another beer. And so waiting for an Uber cab is 10% as stressful as waiting for a cab where you don't know where it is. You don't know whether the man lied to you about when it was going to arrive. You have to keep looking out of the window to go, is that my cab over there? And so Uber didn't change the objective experience of booking a cab very much at all. If you look at things like time, duration, cost a little bit, okay? What Uber really changed was the emotional experience. And because emotion, which drives behavior, doesn't map neatly onto objective reality. In other words, you can take the same thing and change someone's emotional response to it just by telling a little story. So the same thing, a lovely example of this, by the way, about how the same thing can mean different things to different people in coronavirus is wearing masks. Because you must have had a few Chinese and Japanese tourists who'd wear masks around Belgrade or Zagreb or on the coast. And as Europeans, we always thought it was rude, didn't we? We always thought...
Yeah, it's weird, it's awkward.
Yeah. Basically, you're saying we're dirty, that you're coming to our country, you find our country fundamentally unhygienic, so you have to wear a mask. And then someone explained to me, no, the people who always wear a mask in Japan are people who have a cold themselves, and they wear a mask because they don't want to spread it to everybody else. So it's actually done as an act of generosity, not an act of selfishness. And once you told me that, my whole attitude changed. And instead of going, that's a bit bloody rude, bloody hell, I'm not unclean. And instead realizing that they're actually trying to do a favor for society. And so the same thing, exactly the same thing with a different story attached can lead to a totally different emotional response. And that's why two of the things in the book, you can produce magic because you can just change the emotion of something by describing it in a different way. And secondly, the other thing in my book, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. So, sometimes you can, I had a very amusing discussion about this, about how working from home and working remotely will affect cosmetic sales. Okay. And I said, the weird thing is you can respond in two ways, okay? You can either say, well, my face is only appearing on a 3-inch screen, so I don't really have to care about makeup. Or you say, because I'm only visible on a 3-inch screen, I have to make more effort with makeup to compensate for the fact that I'm only that high. Okay.
To make an impression.
So quite often the same stimulus can lead to opposite responses, and an opposite response, an opposite stimulus can lead to the same. And that's why it's very bad having people, rational people involved in marketing who are trying to make it like physics, where there's a right answer and everything else is wrong. Because actually the opposite of a right answer can be another right answer.
Yeah, you know? Right. So you're suggesting also in this period of crisis and pandemic, we should turn off logic and turn on magic, if I understood correctly. Look
for it. The first thing is to look for it, because it's worth looking for. It's not a perfect process. It involves experimentation. But if you understand psychology, the solution space for any problem becomes much bigger, because you're not just looking at universal, average, objective solutions, you're also looking for subjective, specific solutions.
Yeah. Now we've heard.
Right? And the other beautiful thing is you can practice this. I don't know all the businesses I'm speaking to, but you can practice this at every scale. You can practice it at the massive level, you know, of a very large multinational. But if you're running a small cafe, or indeed you can actually use it with your own employees. I'll tell you a lovely story. I'll tell you 2 lovely stories about what I call micro alchemy. I have a friend who worked for Goldman Sachs for many years. And he said, half the success in my career was down to 7 words. And he said, if you're asking someone, if you need someone to do you a favor, if you need someone to work the weekend for you doing some reports, if you need someone to help you, okay, lots of people will say lots of different things. They'll say, I'm sorry to dump this problem on you, or I need you to do me a favor, or I'm terribly sorry to take up your weekend, but you need to do this, da 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 da. No, don't say any of those things. He said, when you say that, when you say those things, you've created a sense of mild resentment, and the person now feels not like a willing volunteer. They feel like a recruit. They feel like they've been drafted, you know.
Okay. But you
said, use these 7 words. He said, I wonder if you can help me. Because it doesn't presume that they're helping. You're not telling them to do it. They feel that their status has risen because you've chosen them. And they feel that if they can help you, it raises their status even more.
And it's their decision.
And it's their decision. And so often, you know, this is what. Now, the other example of micro alchemy I always tell.
It's nice, yeah.
My father wouldn't get pay television. He's now 89. At the time, he was about 83. And I said, look, you're not interested in sport. You're not interested in movies, but you love documentaries, you know, war documentaries, nature documentaries, particularly history. And I said, look, for only £17 a month, you can get, 10 news channels, 24-hour news channels, and 50, 60, 70 documentary channels. And he said, no, it's too expensive. I said, well, I'll pay for it for you. And he said, no, it's still too expensive. I thought, I'm paying. I can't do any better than making it free, I thought. If you think about it, I offered to pay. He said, no, it's still too expensive. And then I tried a little bit of alchemy, and I said, it's not £17 a month, it's 60p a day. And he said, well, what difference does that make? And I said, well, you spend £2 a day on newspapers.
Newspapers, that's right.
So if you spend £2 a day on newspapers, spending another 60 pence, in other words, less than a third of what you spend on newspapers, to get 100 channels, 24 hours a day, showing you news, documentary footage, it's hardly silly, is it? And extraordinarily, I never had to pay for it, because he said, oh, I see what you mean. Now suddenly, the thing that was too expensive, it's called in behavioral science anchoring or framing. If you compare something to something else, whether something's expensive or not, or cheap, depends on what you compare it to. Now, there's a wonderful story that Rolls-Royce cars and Maserati, they stopped selling their cars at car shows because a Rolls-Royce is a very expensive car at a car show. It's probably one of the 5 most expensive cars there. They started selling them at yacht shows and aircraft shows. Because if you've been looking at Learjets all afternoon, or you've been wondering whether to buy a 70-foot
then
yacht,
you have money for Rolls-Royce.
You've got the money. But also, he said, if you're leaving at the end of the day and you've decided not to spend £7 million on a super yacht, the £250,000 Rolls Royce, it's an impulse buy. It's like having the chocolate next to the till. I'll have one of those. And so
it's a comfort.
It's wonderful. What would be a really serious decision if you were buying a car becomes a trivial decision compared to buying a yacht.
Yeah. It's a comfort line. Yeah, that's right. And Rory, I wonder if you can help me answering next question. You see that I read Alchemy. So I'm wondering if you can help me answer the next question. The book is full of really interesting and funny and vivid examples how you can abandon logic completely and still be very successful. What is your favorite example from the book? Is it, I don't know, Red Bull or Rolls Royce, Starbucks, toothbrushes, toothpaste? I know many.
I mean, I love Red Bull because if you think about it, rather like Dyson, it's a business that no sane business would have started. And there's a bit of business advice here. One, if you want to be a successful marketing business, the most important quality you can have is the ability to do things your finance director wants to stop.
Yeah.
And the reason, there's a wonderful theory around this called Carnot Theory, which is a Japanese professor at the University of Tokyo who worked a great deal with the Japanese consumer electronics industry. Now, I don't know how old your audience is because I can't see them.
Yeah,
but,
me neither.
Anybody over the age of 45 will remember this. If you bought a DVD player or you bought a cassette deck in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, logically, what should matter about a cassette deck is battery life, sound quality, build quality, sound reproduction quality. But what you did is you pressed eject, and if the eject mechanism was a lovely where there was a bit of counterbalancing, a little bit of pneumatic, buffering in the action, that's lovely. And if it just went clack, you thought that's rubbish. I don't want to give that house room. Now, in Carnot Theory, he makes the point that actually products, and this is also true of services, contain three elements. They're threshold elements. So a hotel where the roof leaks is not a good hotel, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that if the roof doesn't leak, people go, it's a great hotel, I always stay there because the roof doesn't leak. Nobody notices, nobody cares unless it goes wrong. And those things scale with customer satisfaction sublinearly. Once you reach a certain point, it's no longer a problem, but it's no longer a benefit. Then you have what you might call performance attributes, and those scale kind of linearly. And those are the things which the product's supposed to do: battery life, sound quality, being reliable, rewinding your cassettes quite fast, and those things scale linearly, but they only scale linearly. So there's no magic because you've got to make the thing actually better to make people happier with it, and that might be expensive. And then there are these things he calls delight attributes. If anybody's got a very new car, when you open the door, the mirrors project the brand of the car on the ground, for example.
Oh, really?
Okay, that's a delight attribute. Now, the magic of delight attributes is they scale supralinearly. And the reason finance directors always kill them is, to the finance mind or to the economist's mind, they're irrelevant, and they're the first thing you cut if you're trying to cut costs. So this is a lesson to anybody, by the way, after coronavirus. Don't necessarily cut the things that make sense to cut. And so one of my favorite examples, which is in the book, is simply the Doubletree hotel chain. Okay. Now, if you've ever checked in at a Doubletree, and I'm British, and we call them biscuits, we don't call them cookies. And so I check into a Doubletree in Chicago, and they go, to welcome you to the Doubletree, here is a bag of our signature Doubletree cookies. Okay. And they keep an oven in every hotel underneath the check-in desk, which keeps these cookies warm. Now, being British, I'm a bit more cynical. We don't use the word signature in British English, and signature Doubletree cookies. And we don't use the word cookie. And I'm kind of going, checking in. I've had a long flight to Chicago. I mean, what's this bollocks? For goodness sake. Now I've got to carry this back. But I took them up to the room and I turned on the television. I sat down and I unpacked. And then I got the smell of these cookies because they're warm. And I ate them, and they're delicious. Rather sweetly, during the coronavirus lockdown, Doubletree actually released its recipe so that people could make them at home, which I thought was enchanting. Okay. And the truth of the matter is I haven't stayed at a DoubleTree for 14 years because I've never had the opportunity to. But if my PA said to me, you can have 2 hotels, there's the Marriott or the DoubleTree, 14 years later, I still remember it, and I go, I'll stay at the DoubleTree because you get the cookies.
Yeah, now, it's a signature. Now you see.
It's a signature. Now, interestingly, apparently the finance director of DoubleTree has been trying to kill the cookies for years, and the marketing director, to annoy him, made them bigger. Okay?
He won, definitely.
And so that sort of thing, where a tiny thing is, the point is, it's like poker. It's a tell, what we call a tell in poker, which is a tiny little sign, but it says a lot about the person. And a hotel chain that gives away cookies isn't a hotel chain that's run to the last cent. It's got a little bit of generosity and hospitality to it, as well as just profit maximization. And there's a similar hotel in Los Angeles. If you look up the Magic Castle, Richard Shotton told me this story. He's written a very good book called The Choice Factory, which isn't yet available in Serbo-Croat, but soon will be.
But it will be.
It will be.
We will take care of it.
That'd be lovely. And he tells us, now the interesting thing about the hotel is there's nothing special about it in terms of the architecture. The swimming pool is tiny. It's quite expensive. It's about $250, $300 a night. And the building is quite old-fashioned. The rooms are very clean. I'm not suggesting you can get away with dirty rooms, because that's Carnot Theory. That's a basic requirement. Okay. In Los Angeles, this fairly unremarkable hotel is number 6 on TripAdvisor, which is an incredible achievement, you know, if you consider the hotels that exist in Los Angeles. And what I noticed, and what Richard presented about it, is he said they do a couple of just really charming things. If you get your laundry back, there's a smiley face, and your name's handwritten on the laundry, and there's a sprig of lavender attached to the package in which your laundry is folded. And I think rather sweetly, the laundry is free, which I think is really clever.
Really?
Yeah. No, because it only costs you, you know, a few dollars, because dry cleaning is not that expensive in the US. So, that, you know, you're giving away a few dollars, but it's no big deal. Next to the swimming pool, there's a little thing called a Popsicle Hotline. Now, we don't use the word popsicle either, by the way, in British English. Lollipop or iced lolly. If you lift this telephone next to the swimming pool, someone will come out with an enormous tray of free ice cream on a stick, and you can help yourself.
Yeah, it's nice. It's signature.
And it's signature. And so these are classic examples of alchemy where, when you think about it, you know, the hotel's not, you know, nothing amazing to look at. It's, if anything, it's slightly dated. You know, the architecture looks a bit like the Bates Motel in Psycho, to be absolutely honest. Okay. But they've brightened it up with a bit of color. But what they've obviously got is, now on top of this, I think the staff must have an amazing attitude. You know, they must train the staff very well. But when I say about magic, is the idea that customer satisfaction is a product of rational, objective, measurable attributes like speed, price, room size, all those things, is a terrible, terribly expensive mistake. And what I always say when you use behavioral science, you can't be right. You know, I won't always be able to give you a right answer. But what I would love to do is expand the solution space and say, before you spend £20,000 doing this, have you thought of spending £3,000 doing something else?
Something specific that people
just make it really, really charming. Just make it, you know, really, really different.
Mm-hmm. And since you're observing businesses for a long time, for a long period of years, what human behavior surprised you the most? Do you have any, you know, some expectations and something happened and then you're, how did that happen? How come that they reacted that way? Or nobody can shock you anymore?
No, nothing completely shocks me, because once you understand that the same thing can create the opposite reaction, depending on both the person and the context, you're much less shockable and you're much more ready to cope with ambiguity. Mm-hmm. And you're much less likely to look for something that works for absolutely everybody, I would argue. Mm-hmm. So things that, one thing I'm very interested in, which interests me a huge amount, is things that this is why my colleagues get sick of me talking about video conferencing. Okay. But one of the things that interest me is puzzles where things that obviously make a lot of sense don't get bought. So there are certain categories. And so my question with video conferencing is that it's something went wrong there psychologically, because it's such an obvious thing. Okay. I mean, okay, if you think about, I talked about framing earlier. You know, I jokingly said the other day, look, you know, on the same day, I've had a meeting in Australia, I've had a meeting in Tbilisi, which I've never been to. I've had a meeting with someone in, you know, in Manchester, and I've had a meeting with someone in Atlanta, Georgia. And I said, you know, WPP could buy me a Learjet, and I couldn't do that. And at the same time, we gain 2 or 3 hours of productive hours a day if everybody at least spends 1 day a week working remotely. The other thing is, what does it mean for your staff? Because if you spend 3 days of the week at home and 4 days a week you go into the office, or maybe even 3, do you want your home to be in the middle of a city, or would you prefer it to be by the sea? So, you know, do we have to pay our staff so much? So much of what we pay our staff goes on rent in London. You know, they're actually quite well paid, but they're not particularly rich, because, you know, the London tax, as it were, takes away half their disposable income. And so there are so many obvious reasons to do this, and yet it was so slow to become established. And, you know, this is a terrible thing, but I met the person from Zoom in London, the marketing director, it was about 6 months ago, maybe a little more. And I said, of course, what you really need is a minor pandemic to get this thing off the ground.
No.
And every time I remember saying that, I kind of wince, because it was such a horrible, you know.
You witch.
ooh. And so, you know, because in a sense what it is, it's an interesting problem, and it raises interesting problems for politics. I don't know if anybody from the government's watching, but sometimes I'm
sure they are.
Sometimes I think it might make sense to bring in legislation for a short time, just so you can create a new social equilibrium. Because what often limits people from changing their behavior isn't their own preference, it's the social norm. And if you just create a new social norm around something, it takes time. But what you see is that actually the change in social behavior is a bit like virology. It's a bit like epidemiology, because you get something that's very slow at first, then very fast, then it hits the ceiling. And sometimes it dies out, and sometimes it sticks. So if you take a behavior which in the UK, and this is probably true also where you are, there is still a number of people who drink and drive, who drive a car when they've had too much alcohol.
Nobody does it in
Nobody does that. No, okay. I mean,
in Serbia especially.
In Serbia, okay. I mean, I know in Hungary it used to be very common, and in fact in Hungary it's an offence to drive with any alcohol in your bloodstream, so that it's difficult to have communion in church, for example. You know, there's actually that technical problem that if you have communion wine and you drive home from church, you're kind of breaking the law. Now, what happens in Britain is that it's very slow to change, and then it changes very fast. And that's partly because some of the older people die and younger people come in with a new behavior. But it's also because once you reach a point, to my parents' generation, my parents didn't do it, but my parents' generation did. My generation don't. To my children's generation, even though they drink quite a lot, it's horrific. The idea of doing it is they would actually wrestle someone to the ground to prevent them getting into their car if they'd had too much to drink.
Oh my God, it's a good thing about new generation.
It's a good thing. Yeah. On balance, it's a good thing. Now, understanding, you know, maybe sometimes the thing to do in legislation is just to legislate, let's say seatbelts, okay? Maybe what we should have done is just made them compulsory for 3 months. Now, once you get used to wearing a seatbelt, it's not a change in behavior anymore. And then you can just let the law go and say, if you're a massive libertarian and you hate seatbelts for some reason, okay, after the 3 months is over, it's up to you. But once you get used to wearing a seatbelt, once you get used to video conferencing, then flying to Frankfurt for a 1-hour meeting is going to seem stupid. You know, so one of the interesting things I like to talk about is there a role for what you might call libertarian legislation, which sounds like, but what it is, it's legislation that maximizes people's choice because they're not trapped in a particular social norm anymore.
Mm-hmm. And they feel free, and they're, you know,
and they're still free.
Choices, yeah, but
they're still making the choice. And so, one very interesting way to end lockdown is just to say people who prefer to work from home should have the right to work from home if their work doesn't require their presence. So desk workers should be free to work from home for another 4 months. That will take half. Introverts prefer working from home most of the time, right?
I hope a lot of bosses are watching this and they know what they're supposed to do after the pandemic is gone. Everybody work from home who is, introvert enough.
And actually, I think you'll get more productivity out of those people, but also you'll solve the problem of the office being too crowded. So you'll be able to maintain social distancing in the office, but it's entirely voluntary, And then once you've done the voluntary bit, only use compulsion when you've tried persuasion. And what tends to happen with government is they have lawyers and they have economists. And they tend to look for financial, fining people or rewarding people, bribing people, is the economist's solution. And making something illegal is the lawyer's solution. And they neglect persuasion. Now, persuasion isn't going to achieve everything. I mean, we achieved a reduction in drink driving partly by introducing breathalyzer law and so on. But my argument is you should always try persuasion first and get as many people as possible to do it voluntarily before you hit on compulsion.
Yeah, and use the force. Another question, because we have to hurry up a little bit. There are 11 rules in your alchemy book. Which one do you think is the easiest for people to follow, and which one is the hardest for people to follow out of these 11 rules? What would you say? What goes well with the people and they understand it?
In a business setting, if there were a logical solution, we would have found it already as an interesting rule. Another rule is that logic tends to get you to the same place as everybody else. Because in a business setting, it's very, very difficult to propose something unless you've got a watertight logical argument for it. Because if it goes wrong, you lose your job, okay? And by the way, if something irrational succeeds, the rational people will all pretend it's because of their supply chain management or cost control, or, the rational people will claim the credit anyway. And so when businesses are lucky or intentionally do something mad, like Red Bull, which in research people said tastes disgusting.
Disgusting, yeah.
When you have that, other than entrepreneurs who don't have to report to anybody, other than an entrepreneur, it's extremely difficult in a large organization to break with conventional logic, because the rewards for success, if you're illogical, aren't that great, and the punishment for failure is immense, because the illogical person will be the first person to get blamed if anything goes wrong.
That's right.
And so it's a very similar thing. If you do boring advertising, okay, in a weird kind of way, nobody blames the advertising if the product doesn't succeed. But if you do eccentric advertising, the one thing that doesn't quite make sense is the thing that everybody's going to latch on to. And so it is really, really difficult unless you frame it very cleverly. Unless you say, look, the trouble with being logical about this is we're getting into the same market space as all our competitors. Whatever you say about a really expensive vacuum cleaner, Dyson, or a £400 hairdryer, Dyson, okay. Whatever you say about that space, it may not make much sense, but it's not a crowded space. Okay, you're competing with precisely nobody. And it's very, very hard, other than for entrepreneurs who tend to be slightly mad. Sometimes, by the way, being ignorant can be a huge advantage in business. I don't recommend it. I don't recommend you go into business without doing research. But sometimes being slightly ignorant or even slightly stupid can be a big advantage, because you end up doing something which an intelligent person wouldn't do.
It would be so easy to apply for this job.
We need someone who's eccentric and stupid.
And stupid. That's me.
But just occasionally, the other point I think I always make, by the way, is, which is also to do with being particularly true in government, particularly true in a business meeting, particularly true in a senior business meeting, is to ask childish questions. Because it's a very embarrassing thing to do, but actually it's a very important thing to do. So I remember asking the question, why don't people like standing on trains? Okay, now that's such a self-evident thing. When train overcrowding is defined as one of the metrics they're trying to reduce, it makes you sound like an idiot. Okay, but the very fact that it sounds stupid probably means that nobody's asked it in 20 years. And of course, there could be lots of different reasons. Now, depending on what the real reason is, the solution to train overcrowding may not be more seats. It may be because you can't use your mobile phone because you're holding on to something. So you've lost the use of one arm. Your bag is kind of at risk of being stolen because it's down by your feet. Everything about you is kind of anxious and you can't entertain yourself. Now, it may be that if you just put leaning posts along the window of the train, so that you could lean against a shelf, put your laptop or tablet on the shelf.
Yeah, it's good enough.
Maybe that's good enough. Maybe nobody minds anymore.
And cheaper solution. Yeah,
and it's a much cheaper solution than making the train longer, which means you've also got to lengthen the platforms. By the way, I did have a look at the train journey from Belgrade down towards, there's a wonderful journey from Belgrade to the coast on a narrow railway.
Yeah, it is, but it lasts for 10 hours, I would say.
Well, no, it's it's on YouTube.
Slow ride.
It's incredibly slow, but it looked fascinating.
Yeah,
you see,
it's nice.
I think that's the kind of thing which would be lovely for Alchemy. Now, you could make the train faster, but it's a beautiful ride, right? I mean, I've done it on YouTube. I've never done it in reality. But what if you actually had a bit of the train was open, or the train was really fun, so you were served a meal halfway? Okay, you could turn that into a tourist property. You had a fantastic meal because it goes through what's the ancient the old capital of Montenegro? Is it? There's one of them goes through.
Podgorica, you mean?
It goes through Podgorica. That's absolutely right. Yeah. So I think the train goes through. Now you could turn that into a fantastic tourist attraction.
Yeah, okay, it's a complex story about railways in Balkans. It's a tough question, but we will think about it. It's a political question more than these alchemy ideas, but we need more alchemy in political solutions, definitely in Balkans. But thank you for the observation, because we have potential, but we are somehow stuck on the basics of cooperating in Balkans.
I mean, one of the interesting things is we talk about this third runway at Heathrow, okay. And the truth of the matter is, the main reason people prefer Heathrow to Gatwick is all to do with status. You always get this. You get the high status business airport and the low status tourist airport. And I said you could spend $5 billion on a new runway, but what you could do is, if the train service to Gatwick in business class, in first class, was the most opulent train in the world, most of the stigma with Gatwick could go. So instead of saying, oh no, it's further away from London, so it's at a disadvantage, you say we now have more time to impress the hell out of business travelers by having the best train in the world.
You play with people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely, always. Because ultimately our behavior is determined by our emotions, and our emotions aren't objective. Nobody, if you think about it, I'll give you a lovely story about this. Cunard, which was the great transatlantic liner company, which had the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, and so forth. In the 1930s and 1940s, they used to compete for the Blue Ribbon, which was the fastest crossing of the Atlantic from west to east, I think it was, by ship. Okay, and they would compete with the Normandy, and they'd compete with, there's a fantastic Italian liner, and they'd compete with the United States as to which ship could do the crossing the fastest. And then one day the jet aircraft came along, and if you can cross the Atlantic in 10 or 15 hours, as it might have been at first, you'd stop at Gander. Whether a ship can do it in 4 days or 5 days is now irrelevant. So Cunard realized the only way to survive is to make the journey part of the experience. In other words, we're trying to make the journey fabulous rather than to make the journey fast. What Cunard did, indirectly and unintentionally, they invented the world's cruise ship industry. Because they were the first people to put balconies on a cabin, for example. Most of the innovation in the cruise ship industry came from the necessity of Cunard to realize, okay, we've got to win this psychologically, because we can't win it through the laws of physics, because we're never going to produce a ship that's as fast as a plane.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And I know another example. That's the first business example that I've ever had in my life. And that was the first elevators. They were so slow that people were complaining all the time and then didn't know what to do because it was terribly expensive to make them faster. And you know what they did? They put a mirror, cheap solution, and everybody's watching themselves. And, you know, it goes like this. So
I'll give you a lovely, one of my favorite bits of alchemy, of where the objective doesn't change, the weight doesn't change, but the experience does. Okay, so having customer experience metrics which are too objective is a terrible mistake. Also, asking people what's important to them is a terrible mistake, because they'll all say, make the lifts faster. I want the lifts to be faster. Nobody will ever say, I get bored waiting for the lift, which is the real why of the problem, which is that you're jabbing on a button. By the way, most door close buttons in elevators don't do anything. They're there to make you feel better, because you can press a button and you feel you're speeding something up.
You're in control.
And it's the illusion of control, completely. Exactly. Yeah. And another example would be, I mean, which I love, to anybody who operates a call center, we can do some lovely business with call centers. One, I've yet to get anybody to test this. The perfect place to test it is Israel, because in Israel, it's a law that if you don't answer the phone within 30 seconds, you have to offer to call people back within 30 minutes. Yeah. Now, my contention is, if you do call someone back, they're so happy that you call them back that your chance of cross-selling or upselling something is going to be much, much better than if you make them wait.
Ah, great.
Because you feel like a valued customer because they rang me, rather than a supplicant or beggar because I had to get through to them. The second thing that's magic is live chat on a computer, because it actually takes a long time. The reason it's quite efficient is because the people doing the typing are actually handling 3 customers simultaneously. But the strange thing about live chat is, even though it takes probably 50% longer than handling the same problem by phone, people who solve a problem through live chat are ecstatically happy.
Yeah,
and so customer satisfaction, if you can nudge people off your phone line or off your website and get them to solve the problems by going tappity, 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 tap. Video conferencing might be the future later on, but in the moment, live chat, weirdly, you've just created alchemy, because you've just made people crazily happy, even though the process is cheaper and takes longer.
Yeah, you see, yeah, that's alchemy.
That's alchemy.
Yeah, we ran out of the time. I have, just a few more minutes for the last question for you. So the last question would be, Rory, what is your advice to all the future alchemists? What would you say in a couple of sentences? Your last words for this meeting today.
Gosh, that's a very good question. Read widely on this subject. Also, spend a lot of time. There's a wonderful book called The Economic Naturalist. When you look at business, when you look at human behavior, when you look at people in a shop, adopt the mindset of a biologist or an ecologist. Don't adopt the mindset of an economist. So when you look at a behavior, try and become a bit of an alien. So look at behavior from a distant point and say, why is it that people really do this? Because why aren't people video conferencing? Why won't people buy this product? Which I have a particular obsession, a very strange one, with Japanese toilets. Because if you've ever owned a Japanese toilet, you'll never go back. Okay,
yeah, I know. I remember.
Did you live in Japan?
Nice.
Yeah. It's a wonderful thing, but you can't get Europeans to buy them. Now, why is that? Is it social embarrassment that if you now why that's important is you can take an idea from one place and you can observe it and you can say, I wonder if this same thing applies to something else. Now, my guess would be, if I buy a Japanese toilet, my neighbors are much more likely to buy one. Okay, because it's no longer weird. Now, that's not very important unless you sell Japanese toilets. But if you want people to install solar panels, the same thing applies. Nobody wants to be the first person on the street to have solar panels on their house, but everybody wants to be the 7th person on their street to have solar panels in their house. You've got a lot of sunshine, so the possibility there is fairly abundant. But try and codify strange behaviors and say, now, if that's true, and if you can solve that problem this way, Guinness, people are much more likely to buy Guinness if when they go into a bar, someone's already visibly drinking Guinness. It multiplies by like 2, the likelihood someone will say, I'll have a pint of Guinness. It would almost pay Guinness to pay people to stand there from very early on drinking it. And take a learning like that and go, where else could that solve a problem? Is it that nobody wants to be the weirdo with the solar panels? And therefore, an objective for government is we need to get 2 people in every block to install them. And then once we've got 3 people to install them, the incentives can be cut because now we're no longer competing against the fear of looking weird.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I can make the case for subsidizing Japanese toilets, but the same thing would apply.
Okay, but the conclusion is don't be economists, be magicians.
Yes, absolutely right. Yeah.
And I really hope that not a lot of economists listen to us.
No. They won't like it at all. They don't. They don't.
Like
Actually, really good economists like it. It's the rubbish ones that don't.
Yeah. Okay. So all the economists out of the box.
Out of the box. And as I said, look for magic. Budget time for looking for magic. And then if someone presents you with a finding that seems magical, don't discount it. Ask why. Because you might have discovered some magic you can apply in 5 other places. What's the equivalent of the DoubleTree cookie in your business? No hotel, by the way, this is a really important challenge. No hotel has ever found a way of making the check-out experience great. What might that be?
Yeah, great conclusion. Thank you, Rory, so much for joining us today. And I really hope we'll see each other again in Rovinj.
We shall. Absolutely promise
please
it.
Promise me. Yeah, okay, I'll be there definitely.
I love Zagreb. I've been to Zagreb and a few other places. I've also always wanted to visit Belgrade, and I've never yet managed it. So that's on my bucket list.
Yeah, please come. I'm waiting for you here, but also in Rovinj next summer.
Fantastic.
So we'll meet. Thank you, Rory, so much. Hvala vam svima, draga naša publiko, što ste nas gledali. Nadam se da ste uživali. Ne zaboravite, ovdje je sve. Ako niste stigli na početak ove naše diskusije, ovdje vam je sve unutra, slušala sam sad što Rory priča, više manje su prepričani chapteri iz ove knjige, tako da sve možete naći, ne morate se više vraćati na ovaj naš intervju i naručite odmah. Ko naruči odmah, prvih 100 besplatna poštarina. Tako da evo, nadam se da sam dala ovaj biskit iz DoubleTree hotela, da imate dovoljno argumenata da se družite s nama i dalje. Ovo je bilo tek prvo Imagovo izdanje, a mi čekamo i ostale, pa se družimo na ovakvim Zoom eventima nadalje, kad već ne možemo se stiskati uživo. Još neko vrijeme će proći, ali kao što Rory kaže, iako smo tu doma svak za sebe, ipak smo se naučili da je tehnologija dovoljno snažna da se možemo družiti i virtualno i da nam bude zabavno. Još jednom puno hvala što ste nas gledali i special thanks to Rory again. Kiss to everybody.
Perfect. Bye-bye, and thank you also to Petra and Mate for doing a fantastic job on the AV. It's been wonderful.
You don't see them, but they're here all the time.
They're here all the time. They've been wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.